I'm very excited. It's my pleasure to introduce today's special guest, Dr. Svetlana Jović. Svetlana is an associate professor of developmental psychology at the State University of New York at Old Westbury, and a sociocultural psychologist who specializes in critical sociocultural analysis using narrative, sociolinguistic, visual, and spatial methods. Her research examines how children and youth develop in contexts shaped by poverty, migration, cultural diversity, and integration. Now, if you have questions that arise during Svetlana's presentation, you can share them in the chat box, and we will also be sure to create some space towards the end of our time together for folks to ask questions live if they're comfortable. So welcome, Svetlana, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to YouthREX for hosting this event, for inviting me. I'm just so happy to be here, as I expressed also earlier before the event started. So just to know if it makes any difference for anyone, I do have big screen, so I can't see people as I present. So feel free to turn your video on, because I like seeing faces as I talk, but it's fine either way. But I know very often speakers kind of cannot do it all. But now I'm lucky enough to have this, multiple screens that I can use. So I'll just kind of take a moment to move things around so I can see you all, as well as my slides. Great. So again, thank you, Katie, for introducing me. And also to position myself a bit further beyond what I shared in my bio. I come from a youth work background, actually, right? So before returning to academia, I worked as a youth worker at a community center in France. And what brought me to New York City, and I'm actually located in New York City. I mean, I commute, I do reverse commute, right? I go to work outside of the city. It's kind of on Long Island, if you know the geography of New York State, a bit outside of New York City. So what brought me to New York City is a youth organization where I volunteered for a year, and which later became a site for my first research project in New York City. So I will not present that research in the kind of ancient, but it's kind of my activist work that brought me to academia after a break of working as a youth worker between my master's and my PhD. So how I set a presentation today, you will see, and I expect a diverse audience from what Katie said, right? So I try accommodating people in academia and practitioners, right? So I will only start in a very theoretical way, just because I need to define. If I say narratives, and there's broad variety, right, of kind of how people understand what narrative is. So I had to position myself in certain ways, right? How I use narrative, what I mean by it, and how I use language. So my beginning will be theoretical, and then I move into kind of a presentation of my kind of empirical work that showcases, right, kind of this methodology that I'm presenting today. And I will end by presenting some practical, right, kind of ways in which we can use the research methodology that I'm presenting, right? So and thank you for this. This actually kind of made me think again, right, kind of beyond how I use my research in my teaching to how we could use this research in working with young people, right? I kind of love going back to that kind of thinking again. So yeah, I was very happy you made me kind of put this presentation together. So as I prepared this presentation, I was also mindful of my role as a developmental psychologist who employs language and narrative, along with various literary approaches, as you will see shortly, to study human development. And for that reason, I felt it important to begin by clarifying, as I said before, how I understand and apply language and storytelling in my work. So, okay, let me just see all right. So I use an approach to narrating that is based on a sociocultural theoretical premise of the interdependence of individual with the social, material, and historical. So those of you who may be familiar with that approach, some prominent names, some consider the founder of this approach, Lev Vygotsky, but some prominent names today are Michael Cole, Barbara Rogoff, right? So that's the kind of theoretical framework I align with. And I also use an approach to narrating that is based on the emphasis on people's sense-making capacities, right? So And as all approaches drawing from a sociocultural framework, right, as there are multiple, a narrating approach that I will present today is in essence dialectical. That means that it studies phenomena in movement historically, right, and relationally as they develop. And for that reason, as I hope you will be able to see, this approach places great importance on designing research studies in a way that allows development of these complex and sometimes contradictory meanings in context, right? So some researchers, clinicians, right, they're kind of not fond of contradiction because it's hard kind of making sense out of it, right? But in the research kind of work that I'm doing, we're all about contradictions, right? And how we can create it, right? How we can invite multiple storytelling, create multiple storytelling activities, so we can create, right, kind of get insight into this contradiction. But as I said, this sounds theoretical. You will be able to see how that looks when we design a study. So the way that the narrating approach I'm proposing today is different from some other narrative approaches, is that it regards narrating primarily as the process of interpretation, right, and not reproduction or representation of our experiences and actual life events. So why I'm saying this is because there are many, and maybe actually more popular narrative approaches out there that are about this, right? That are about representation and reproduction. When we think about big life history stories, like stories that are about actual life events, that's kind of narrative work that cares about the content. It cares about the aboutness, right? What it is that you are talking about. It cares about veracity, right? The narrative, kind of the discursive, I should maybe say, not just narrative approach that I take, is primarily concerned with how people use, right? How people use narrative to interpret the world around them and they place in it. And with the ways in which meaning they make incorporates the social context, right? So what are we doing with the stories that we're telling, right? So it kind of goes beyond the content of what we're saying. So maybe it could be a good place to kind of make a distinction between the narrative work that I do and, let's say, kind of content analysis that is out there, right? Not to get me wrong, content analysis is awesome. And these days we can get so much doing that kind of analysis that can be done even automatically with qualitative data analysis software such as MaxQDA, NVivo, Atlas TI, right? Depending on which one you have access to, you can even automatically do. And I did play with it with my students, right? So you automatically, let's say we looked at politician speeches pre and post 2016, and then looked, right, you plug in the words you wanted to look for, right, kind of immigration, right? It's just kind of seeing how their speeches evolved over time, right? So yes, content analysis, awesome, it's out there, but it's not narrative analysis, right? There's also thematic analysis out there that is a very common way in which people understand qualitative research, also legitimate qualitative approach, right? But still not a narrative analysis, right? And I will present a few different narrative analysis today. In order to kind of, so all my research projects were designed following the principles that narrating is a dynamic relational activity, right? That people use narrating to interact with others that may be actually present or implicit, right? We are in a dialogue with someone even when we're sitting down and writing a story that someone invited us to say, right? So it doesn't have to be, so it can be someone actually present or implied. And in order to account for this lifelike diversity in narrating, all my research studies involve participants in multiple narrating activities, employing different narrative genres, created for different purposes, and directed toward different audiences. So these diverse designs allow for multiple perspectives within the issues explored in each respective study. And today I picked 3 studies that I will focus on. I'm using studies to illustrate, right, how methodology can be employed, and then hopefully that inspires you. And some of it, I think we can kind of, it's more conducive, right, kind of to being inspirational for youth work. So engaging participants in multiple narrating practices helps researchers understand the participants' range of experiences around the question of interest. Because when you think about it, when we narrate from one perspective and for one particular audience, certain issues may be minimized, right, or even silenced due to, for example, power dynamics between the present or envisioned interlocutors, right? So what I would say to this person, I wouldn't necessarily say that or in that way to another person in my life, right? So since the issues that participants mention in their narratives are likely determined by the present and implied readers and listeners of the narrative, eliciting narratives from multiple stakeholders' perspectives gives sound to voices that would otherwise remain silent, right, had we included only one stakeholder's stance. So storytelling, right? So these are some highlights, right, of this approach, that it's dynamic and relational, right? And in order to grasp what a narrator is doing with a story, we need to take into account this what we call narrator audience issue meaning system, right? So this is about who is telling the story, to whom, and for what purpose, right? And in order to really understand any story that people create, we need to understand, right, this rhetorical triangle. So by designing multiple expressive activities and asking participants to provide more than one narrative on the same issue, right, and by engaging them in multiple relational stances, we open possibilities by inviting complexity and my favorite, contradiction, right, in people's narratives. So let me start giving you examples, illustrations of this. So the first project I will share with you is a study that we just finished collecting the data. We finished that part of the research in March, and now we're in the will be in the midst of analyzing the qualitative part of the data. So here the project was funded by National Science Foundation of Republic of Serbia, and this was my return to that context after 19 years of being away. So we wanted to see the narrativization of ethnic identity among diverse youth living across Serbia. So the context is the Republic of Serbia, right? But we also recruited adolescents, high school students from different regions where there are higher populations of the most, right, significant numerically minorities in Serbia, right? And those are youth of Bosniak background who are of Muslim religion. And just to contextualize for those who may be less familiar, here racially, the only difference that exists among people in this region is between Roma people, right, and the rest of the population, right? The rest of the population is white. And then the differences between people are cultural, religious, historical, right? So in that sense, racial issues are of a different nature than in Canada and then in the US, right? To provide the context. So the only racial minority in that more narrow sense are Roma people, but other significant, in numerical sense, majorities are Hungarians, right, in the north. That's that little X sign in the north of the country. As I said earlier, Bosniaks, who are Muslim Hungarians, or Catholic religious background, culturally dominant, right, Serbian youth are of usually Orthodox, right, Christian orientation. We had other, right, smaller, right, also minority groups, but those are really statistically negligible numbers, right, to be able to make any to run any analysis, quantitative analysis. So that's the context. And now I don't have, it's not the time, right, to go deeper into the history of this region, but it went through multiple civil wars in relatively recent history. It was all part of a larger country, Yugoslavia, that fell apart in the early 1990s. So it's a region that has been characterized, right, by stark, but social, cultural, ethnic tensions over the past few decades. It could be argued during a much longer period than that, but that's for a different conversation. And our focus was on adolescents' narratives of identity, belonging, and cultural difference, right? Just to give you some idea, I mean, I'm not presenting here the whole study. It was a major study, right, involving 3,000 students, 2,000 students, 3,000 participants total, 2,000 students, 400 teachers, over 600 parents, right? Other kind of school officials. So we really wanted to take perspectives, including perspectives of multiple stakeholders when it comes to these issues. As I said, I'm not presenting them, just to give you some idea about the scope of the study. The goal was to explore how youth make sense of diversity and inequality in their everyday lives. And approach we used, and here, as I said, like I'm just focusing on the qualitative aspect of the study, right? So we collected kind of massive, kind of data, quantitative data, and then I was in charge of the qualitative aspect of the study, right? I kind of came in with my methodology, and kind of you'll get to see kind of that there's that recognizable flavor in what I do. And the approach, right, inviting youth to tell stories through multiple voices and perspectives. So let me show you an illustration. So this was the main vignette. There was something else we created about social media influencer, right? But I'm just going to focus on this example to give you an example of how it looked like in this study. So this is a vignette they were given, and it was created intentionally in a way that's a bit ambiguous, right? We try making it gender neutral always, right? So sometimes grammar may sound kind of clunky just because we're trying to be right and to leave it open. So it's also because vignettes are also semi-projective techniques, right? Kind of you want people to read into them, their thoughts, their fears, their intentions, and so on. So it says a new student arrives at a school. They don't seem to be from around here. They're initially met with curiosity and interest from their classmates, but as time passes, some students begin to make inappropriate comments about them and their ethnic background. Hearing these comments, the new student tries to resolve the situation directly with the students who are making these insulting comments. The situation culminates over the recess during a discussion about a provocative political topic, when someone from the group starts calling out the new student in front of everyone and making negative comments about their ethnic identity. So what happens next, right? So this is usually kind of the first step we show participants. And now comes the part where we're asking them to first kind of not just elaborate, but first prompt, here just a shorter version of it, right? We say, what do you think happened next, right? Who was involved? How did your situation get resolved, right? So we wanted to see how they see this kind of, because when you think about in terms of the story plot, right, the elements that needs to be there for us to have a story, this one is incomplete, right? It's missing a resolution. Every story has a resolution, right? In this case, it's even a conflict resolution, right? But each story needs to resolve somehow, right? Sometimes there's even a coda, right? Kind of morale of the story. So here we're asking them to kind of finish this story. Then they're asked to retell the story from the new student's perspective, right? So we prompt that, we say, imagine now that you are that new student and that you're writing to your best friend from the previous school, right? So tell your friend in detail what exactly happened at school that day, right? And then the next writing prompt, and for those who are kind of methodologically pedantic, yes, we did counterbalance, right? Kind of the order of the prompts we presented. Then the next writing prompt was the so-called culprit perspective, right? So we say, imagine now that you are the classmate who made an insensitive remark towards a new student. You're writing to your best friend who is away from school that week. So tell your friend in detail what exactly happened in school that day, right? So there's yet new retelling of the story. And then the final story, I like including that, and I'll tell you more about this a little later. It's personal experience, right? Because I even have one paper where I focused on this autobiographical versus hypothetical / fictional genres, right? So I like looking at how do stories that we write about our personal experiences, how they differ from the stories that in this narrative sense, and you will see the analysis around it alone. Of course, they differ when you're writing about yourself, right? But how they differ in terms of the kind of psychosocial dynamics that we cover, right, and we unpack in those stories. And they do. And let me give you a spoiler actually right away. Personal stories tend to be kind of less personal, right? So from the perspective of narrative analysis, fictional, hypothetical stories are much juicier, right, in terms of what's going on there. And I will show you some analysis that illustrate that. So when it comes to this project, as I said, this is just a sliver here, right? So I can't share now with you comparisons between different stories because that's the qualitative part that is part of my sabbatical, right, kind of project. I'm on leave this year, so I'll be working on that. But if you're interested in kind of plethora of quantitative data from this project, right, you could scan this code or go to our website, right? This is the name of the project, NIDEA, NIDEA. And there's kind of tons of stuff that we published already because quantitative part is easy, right? Also shout out to my qualitative researchers because that's so much more time consuming, right? Quantitative papers, you can just print them out, but qualitative work takes a bit more time, and you will see why from the analysis I'm about to show. So now moving on, right? So next I will talk about a project that concerns particularities of growing up in the contemporary urban settings, characterized by multiple forms of diversity, right? And here I'm talking about New York City. Yeah, I spoiler already. So one thing that characterizes lives of youth growing up in these contexts is that they cross multiple boundaries of class, race, culture, and neighborhood daily, right? In this big city, you hop on a train in one neighborhood, like 5 stops later, you get off in a world that is completely different materially and symbolically, right? So I use narrative as a tool for looking into youth sense making about important relational dynamics that they may be encountering daily. So I will showcase now multiple discursive expressions that can be used to study and illustrate how youth's sense-making processes are shaped by the contexts in which they are embedded. So this is the study where I use similar methodology, right? But that has been analyzed. So I have specific findings to share with you there. I kind of share the kind of how the methodology can look like. But here I can substantiate it more. So one of the premises of this work is that our concrete embodiments of kind of as members of a specific class or race and gender for that matter, right? As well as our concrete historical situations play important roles in shaping our perspective on the world, right? So we don't have so the stories that we can create are shaped by the journey that we have traveled in our body, right? So the goal of this project was to explore how different socioeconomic, racial, but you will see how I talk about privilege. So it's kind of many of these things together. I use kind of 8 different variables to create this combo variable that I then call privilege. So I explored how these different circumstances may shape the way adolescents make sense of and act upon issues of injustice in particular, right? And now you can sense kind of, this is where this methodology is coming in. I wanted to see how their sense making about fairness shifts, if it shifts and how it shifts, as they alternatively take perspectives of the self, object, and subject of injustice. And this is illustration. Now I'm not for this, because I'll present more data. I kind of didn't go into the vignette, but there was again vignette developed for this study. And just so you know, I develop these vignettes always with friends who are either who are drama, like playwriters, right, kind of screenplay writers. And in the meanwhile, I learned a lot about literary techniques, right? So I also became good at this myself, right, developing these vignettes, right? So I bring in the psychological aspect of it, right? But I need a training in the kind of literary aspect of like how to create these stories that will provoke, right, kind of long and elaborate narratives. It's a skill. And these days with AI, we're all talking about like prompt engineering, right? So let's say, yeah, I'm a prompt engineer of sorts. So this method, right, that we call dynamic narrating. So again, there's a vignette developed for the purpose of the study that is ambiguous enough, right, kind of that you can project your, again, thoughts, intentions onto it. And we had participants retell the story 4 times. Again, just a coincidence, right? So, and we had, again, an autobiographical story. So what's called here personal perspective, right? And then we had them retell the story from the culprit, because there is, again, a peer who might have done something, right, to exclude another peer, something that was unfair, sneaky, maybe not, right? So kind of, it's really different, like what teens read into this vignette. And then we had them retell the story from the victim perspective, right? For a same friend using the same genre of communication, right? Writing an email to a friend who wasn't at school. And then the final story was from the victim perspective, but we identified it as the victim perspective. In the prompt, I said, imagine now that you are, right, that teen who got excluded, and that you think that what happened to you is not fair, right? And you are to write a letter, right, to a school official, and then you leave it blank. They usually write to a school counselor, right, or some teacher, or a teacher if they're close to a specific teacher, retelling them about what happened, right? So again, if you remember what I said earlier, well, it sounded still very theoretical. Here, the reason we do this is because methodology allows us to see that there are issues that are minimized and even silenced when we narrate from a specific perspective, right? That can be put forth and even emphasized when we are invited to narrate from a different perspective, or for a different audience, or sometimes even using a different genre of communication. So now I want to illustrate for you, right, kind of the analysis that can be used to look into these different writing activities, right? So this study that I'm talking about, we had these 4 different writing activities, right? And I will tell you about the first narrative analysis, just because it's a very simple one. And this is also for grad students here, right? And those who feel brave enough to venture into qualitative methods. This is a good, simple analysis to start with, right? And this is the analysis that's called psychological state expressions analysis, right? So what we're doing here, simply put, we're analyzing for the words that refer to psychological states. And we talk about words that refer to cognition and words that refer to affect, right? And this is something that Jerome Bruner, great narrative psychologist and cultural psychologist, this is something that he called the landscape of consciousness, right? So each story has a landscape of action and a landscape of consciousness. Landscape of action is when we describe the setting, right? It was a beautiful September day, or it was a rainy and gloomy September day, right? You're describing, you're setting up the scene, you're mentioning the characters, who's there. All of that is like landscape of action. But then Bruner said, there's landscape of consciousness. That's that language that we use to bring characters to life. So when we give someone thoughts and feelings, that's how we give them agency. That's how we bring them to life. So if we take one narrative, and I didn't put this here so we necessarily read it from top to bottom, but this is just to show you, right? I took this from XQDA, right, kind of narrative that I analyzed, like copy pasted it here. So I highlighted with blue expressions that refer to cognition: found out, make sure, I know, right, lie, find out, right? And highlighted with red are words that refer to affect, right? Need, I needed, want, ha ha ha, laughter, we also code, right, as affect, happy, mad. So those are verbs, but also nouns that we can code, right? As long as there's kind of consensus among your research team, right? Kind of, yeah, if you work in a team or have research assistants, right? We kind of easily come to a consensus how we code this. And we still, right, even with differences, we reach kind of inter-rater reliability of over 90%, right? Because as I said, it's a very simple narrative analysis. And now we can add a new layer, right, kind of over that analysis, right? So we analyze the psychological language attributed to characters. And now we can see how is that psychological language, that life, that agency given to characters, how it's distributed over different characters. This may be overwhelming for a second when I show the next slide, but bear with me. So here I coded, so now color coding refers to, right, psychological states and the person, right, the character they refer to. We found out, I saw, right? So red and purple refer to the first person singular and the first person plural, I and we, right? You is coded with green, and then third person is coded with this turquoise color, right? I will show more in a few moments, but it's a very tedious analysis, right? I'm doing this with hundreds or thousands of narratives that you may have. So as I said, character mapping, right, kind of help us see how authors focalize their use of psychological state expressions and actions on one character instead on the other. And you will see, I will share the findings with you shortly. So first major finding that I will share with you today is that these different genres, right, different relational contexts, remember 4 different stories, comparing them, right? So I saw that there's systematically varied use of narrative strategies, at least these last 2 that I shared with you, across 4 different activities genres, right? So we can see, just looking at the graph, right, there's slight difference, right? Personal stories tend to have the lowest use of both cognition and affect, right? And then victim stories tend to have the highest use, right, of these psychological state expressions. Maybe it's for a different occasion of unpacking that further, but I can just briefly say we usually find that in these victim stories because, and you will see if you notice, they're also more cognitive than affective. That can be counterintuitive. But that's because when we position as a victim, right, it requires more intense work figuring out, right, kind of making sense out of what happened and articulating that. In another study, we also found that these stories where we are kind of more vulnerable, we tend to be more cognitive than affective, which sounds counterintuitive. Here I'm showing just for the sake of illustration, right? If we compare different narratives from the same person, we can see, so notice the one on the right, narratives from the victim's perspective, has many more blue, right, kind of codes. And just to know, if you have a thought, yeah, but this narrative seems a little longer, I use this measure that I called word interval, right, where I talk about frequencies of expressions per word, right? So it's all adjusted to the narrative length. So of course it has more, it's slightly longer than the one on the left. But when I create tables with numbers, right, it's adjusted for the length of the narrative. Of course, we need to do that. But here I kind of share just so you can see a pattern that was, right, kind of a pattern we found across the board, that victim narratives tend to be more cognitive in comparison to and not affected, right, which we would expect. Another major finding that now I compared, because teenagers included in this project came from various neighborhoods. I worked with multiple, I forgot at this point how many community youth organizations around the city, trying to recruit them from very different zip codes. But the data I took into account is where these teens live, the school they go to, right? Parents' employment status, number of parents at home, parents' profession, parents' level of education, languages spoken at home, right? Am I forgetting anything, right? So it's kind of all of that helped me create these groups that I called higher, lower, and I also have middle privilege, but here I just kind of focus on these 2 extreme groups. So I think I did a fair job of articulating, not just kind of throwing the term and using the word privilege, but it is in one of my papers calling out injustice, like from, I think, Language and Communication, where I really spell out, right, what I mean by privilege, and right, kind of it's all these things taken right into consideration. So what I found, this is something very interesting. So when you look at teenagers from higher privilege, you see how there's little variation, at least less variation than what we see here, right, among teenagers coming from lower privilege. Higher privilege, we see kind of, if we look at culprit and victim email, no difference in how they use cognitive and affective expressions, right? But in general, right, they kind of don't change much in the way they narrate when they take different perspectives, right? And then when we look at teenagers from lower privilege, here it's kind of little variation, but great variation right between personal story and culprit email and then victim email, right? So we see much more going on in terms of how they're changing the way they address different others, right, as they embody, right, kind of different characters in the story. I'll elaborate, provide further interpretations shortly. Let me just share the last finding, is that less privileged youth focus more on non-I characters, non-I actors in the stories, right? So less privileged teens, they account for multiple actors' perspectives, right? So what we found, so for example, this is, I just kind of picked exemplary, right, kind of narratives to illustrate. So this is a narrative from a teenager from higher, that I put, I shouldn't read higher SES, kind of higher privilege. We see kind of, it's all about we, right, kind of first person, but plural in this case, right? And then few, right, psychological state expressions and actions attributed to third person characters. And then example of a teenager that was in a kind of lower privilege group, there's much greater focus on other characters, third persons, right, in the story, and far less on the self. Here we only have I talk, right, kind of few times. Okay, I talked, I asked, I talked, right, got you to, etc. So, so this is a pattern found general across the board, right? The kind of teens from more privileged backgrounds tend to focus more on the protagonist, on the first person characters, right? While teenagers from less privileged backgrounds distributed more evenly agency, right, over multiple actors in the story, right? So it's not just about me and us, but it's also a lot of action and thoughts and feelings given to other characters in the story. I'll take a breath, intention. This is from my teaching, right? So it's kind of strange not being in a room, but in a room, I allow for a few moments of silence. Sorry if I inundated you with data, but I'm bringing us to the kind of summary of this study. So as I put here, higher socio-cognitive flexibility, that's how I call it. And then from peer study on, I continued using and developing this concept, this theoretical concept of socio-cognitive flexibility, right? So it's similar to something that can be called perspective shifting, right? It is a skill that I would say is important, foundational for empathy, right? But that ability to shift, to take perspective, right? To be capable to be good at embodying perspectives of others, right? And performing better, both as a culprit and a victim of exclusion, right? So I found that skill developed to a higher degree, right, among teenagers from less privileged backgrounds. So they showed greater variation across 4 narrative activities. They showed greater capacity to read, interpret, and embody perspectives of different actors. They were more skillful at relating to and performing as both the object and subject of injustice. And they showed greater flexibility in adjusting their experience, knowledge, and communicative styles, right, to the audience they were addressing or to the task that they were given. So when you think about, and I'm always mindful, I think it's even in description, it used to be in the description of my bio, whenever we study something like this, right, it's not from a deficit perspective, right, where we're showing some advantages that come as Uma Narayan calls it, epistemic advantages, right, that people have. We need to be careful, right, not to romanticize the hardship, right, that kind of brought this epistemic advantage. But it tends to be something that we notice, right, that it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, I can relate to it as an immigrant, right? So you are adjusting. I have my immigrant self. I have my American self. I know how to perform, right? And I know how to code shift in certain contexts, right? So I don't feel at home everywhere, right? So those who are in a position of less power always need to adjust to those who are in a position of greater power, right? native speakers don't adjust, right? Kind of, I mean, yes, I mean, you can adjust how you speak, but you need to learn your ways. You need to learn how to communicate. You need to learn what not to say, right? You need to learn culturally, right? Kind of what's appropriate, what's not. So, so students need to adjust, right? To professors, youth, to, right, whoever has more power to kind of police, right? So it's always, and when you think about having to kind of code shift in this sense, of course, it then kind of develops that muscle. And it makes sense that eventually you become much more flexible in that regard. And as I said, and I really see it as a kind of developmental advantage, right? Because if we value empathy as a human characteristic, right, then this is a great thing. I mean, the origins of this idea, this is not that I came, you know, that, oh, my research is kind of mind-blowing in that sense. But these ideas are very old, right? They kind of come from Du Bois and his notion of double consciousness, right? Kind of today, we just use different terminology. It's kind of similar to, as I mentioned before, kind of, it is a kind of epistemic advantage. But what specifically is going on here, right, in terms of social cognition, right, kind of, I thought that this term is appropriate, right, for what I'm talking about, socio-cognitive flexibility. And the final, and actually, before I move on to the next study, here I presented just a couple of very simple narrative analysis, right? I also do plot analysis, right? Value analysis. These are simple to show, right, for the sake of time. But it's just to give you an idea, like using two simple analysis, how much we can reveal, right, from these different narrating activities, right, written by the same person, right? And think about how much more wealth of information you can gain, right, if you're creative with what you're looking at, right? But kind of hopefully I'm managing to illustrate that there's such wealth in allowing, right, this multi-voicedness, inviting it in working with young people, and hopefully you also get inspired and think about how it can be used in direct work with youth. And I will provide some concrete recommendations. I mean, share some ideas as well. The last study I will mention, so the next project I would like to talk about expands the verbal narrative approach. So far, I only shared I talked about narrating as a kind of verbal activity into the domain of visual and spatial methodology. So this was a project where I used photography, but we used geotag photos, so that also allowed us spatial analysis, right? Because the project was a year long, so it allowed me to see, right, kind of how the lives of young people unravel, right, kind of where their lives take place over the scope of kind of one academic year. But I will not talk much about spatial analysis here. So this was a photography-based project, right? As I put here, New York City youth's exploration of community inequality and youth engagement through participatory action research with students. I wasn't here in the capacity of a faculty, just so you know, so there was no, right, conflict of interest in that sense, right? So I was at a rich private school in another part of the town, and that was my way of redistributing wealth. I got a big grant from them and then brought it to Bronx Community College, located in the South Bronx. And I'll say more about the context next. But here I'll talk about this project, just kind of focusing on the pattern that I saw in this project as well, that regards autobiographical versus hypothetical fictional narrating, right? So of course, this project was like a year long. There's so much, right, that we have, but here I just kind of focus on like a tiny aspect of it. But given how little I will tell you about it, I need to present, right, kind of extensively the context. I mean, you're still in an international context. You're still not an American state, right? So this is an international context. So I should be more sensitive in presenting, right? Kind of explicating where the study took place. So it took place at Bronx Community College that is located in the South Bronx. And I put the yellow star, if you notice on the map, right? Kind of that's where the college is, but be mindful where it is, right? It will become relevant in a few moments when I show other maps. And South Bronx is part of the poorest congressional district in the US, right? So the US has 435 districts, right? And this is the poorest congressional district in the whole country. So 45% of youth, people below 18, live below the poverty line, right? Kind of in this area. And at that Bronx Community College, at the time I did a project 7 years ago, the graduation rate, 2-year graduation rate was under 1%. And their 3-year graduation rate was between 6 and 11, depending on reports. And then it went up a little a few years later. So so that was kind of the initiating motivation, right? So when I also started doing research on why such a high attrition rate. So the main reason, by the way, now side note, a tiny digression, besides the financial one, was the lack of the sense of community. And for me, that was such an oxymoron, right? You have a community college, and the main reason why people drop out is because they lack the sense of community. So that's how it all started. So, so here I would just kind of show you this kind of Central Park North divider, right? That's Manhattan here, and this is Central Park. And this is one border that is really kind of visible, invisible border of race and class in New York City, right? If I show you also another map, right? So this is a map of income, so you can see stark difference, right? Lower Manhattan, kind of an upper Manhattan and South Bronx, right? The lowest income. But also when we look at demographics, right? It kind of matches the previous map, right? Kind of darker red signifies areas where there are more people of color, right? So pretty similar, right? I used one now, it's not relevant, like during COVID cases, right? When that was relevant, also looked exactly the same, like almost, you know, the same visually as these two maps. So just to give you an idea about where, right, the context. And Manhattan and Bronx are 2 of the boroughs of New York City, right? 3 other boroughs are Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. So that's where the project took place. So it is important to note that, I mean, I said it before, that this is part of a larger project. I mean, this is created by participants, our logo, right? We named the project Narrating NYC. And the project aimed to foster South Bronx youth's sense of agency and ownership over the communities to which they belong. And using photography, writing and mapping through photo geotagging that I mentioned before, as diverse vehicles of storytelling, we explored students' sense of community and their experiences of power arrangements through social class, race, and other power dynamics. So I actually, just because the nature of life, we couldn't do everything purely in a participative manner. Students left after graduating, right? So we couldn't write and publish together. So sometimes I like rather calling it community-based action research, because it wasn't truly participatory from the beginning to the end, right? So to best meet our project aims, we adopted this community-based PAR approach, doing research with, right, instead of on or about communities, that is participants, right? So we wanted our students to take the lead in the project, right, with my role as a facilitator. And a few words about PAR, right? Kind of PAR is, just if there's anyone not familiar with it, it is committed to making a meaningful contribution to social change, right? Beyond what some call like Paulo Freire, what he called like armchair revolution, right? And beyond journal article, as others call it. So it's in the tradition of public scholarship, right? That reaches communities beyond the academia and policymakers. So what we did, we had weekly or sometimes bi-weekly meetings over an entire academic year, and we used photo voice methodology, among other things. Here, I won't get into, right, kind of how all the weeks look like in different photo missions. We call them photo missions, right, where participants had to explore between 2 meetings. I'm showing this just to maybe kind of focus on some of them. These are the missions, right, kind of short names for the missions we had over the course of that year. But I wanted to illustrate it here again. In developing these prompts, I developed, because we would come up with a topic during our weekly or bi-weekly meeting, and I would go home and right, think of a prompt, right, for that topic. So they would say, oh, next we want to explore gentrification, right? And then I would think of ways of how we do that. And again, I played with the rhetorical concepts, or like I need to do like, usually Zoom speakers, like Zoom is the only way to, you know, like prevent me from using my hands too much. You think Italians did it? You know, you haven't met my folks. So it's kind of that triangle, right? Audience, purpose, context. So to give you one example, when we explore gentrification, or actually like a more simple one, what is the one? Community college. That was during the time when our college got a new president, right? And the prompt was, there's a new president, and, you know, I use actual names, right? And the president wants to kind of hear from all the stakeholders on campus, right? So imagine there's a town hall meeting, but not everybody can attend it, right? I would also name the room where that meeting takes place. So in lieu of being there, right, those people cannot make it, right, should write a letter to the president, right? And etc. Right? So there's always kind of meaningful engagement, right? So we're always engaging students in something that they could actually be doing in real life, right? So here again, I'm not kind of going into each one of these 13 missions we explored, but in each one, right, it was always something, right? And I was always mindful about audience, perspective, right? You take vantage point, audience you're addressing, and the medium of communication, right? And today, speaking of medium, think about like all this in kind of analog, what I'm presenting, and think about a possibility of the online, right? Kind of media that could be used to communicate. So that's, for example, completely absent from what I'm presenting today. So to give now a few illustrations, just to tell you what happened throughout this project. So we explored, so students were taking their photographs, and there were always accompanying narratives, right? So photographs, 3 photographs each week, and then some narrating they had to do to accompany it. So it was all very personal. 10 weeks into the project, we did something different. We brought these photographs that you see here are not students' photographs. They're from the Bronx Historic Society, I forgot the exact name of the institution, photographs, right, of New York City. So, and they were working with these other people's photos, right, but that are relatable, right? They recognize they're from their neighborhoods. And then they actually, the discussion that day was about these someone else's photographs, and something shifted. And that was the first time in that project that students started explicitly talking about race and class. Before that, it was really personal. They're students, they talk about what they don't like on campus, right? It was very color and class blind, right? And this moment, when we started talking about someone else's photography, someone else's stories, something shifted. And then the rest of the project, right, we elaborate on that in one of the papers we published. The rest of the project had a very different tone, right? Became much more critical because they realized, right, this is about something else as well. And this is just excerpt from what one of the students said. Like, I like the contrast. Actually, I'll just read it highlighted. It shows the different classes, and they're just so far away from each other, worlds apart. We're so far out here. We can only see the forest. We can't get to the trees. We can't climb. We're powerless almost. So here, and again with this, and there's kind of much more that happened during that 2-3 hour long meeting, right? So we see how the distance, right, that we have from our own, right, experiences, how it can really provide a buffer that allows us to discuss issues that are actually much more personal than when we talk about our own life, right, our daily life. And they share really intimate things about like what brings you sense of serenity, what are the most important communities in your life, right? They shared like very intimate things up to that point, right? But it really didn't have that kind of social and political component that it started having, that it was kind of encouraged, in a way, not encouraged, invited by this discussion of someone else's photos all of a sudden, right? So, because when you think about impersonal, that is autobiographical accounts, the author is directly associated with, right, and possibly scrutinized by the audience for their actions, thoughts, feelings, right, conveyed in the story. And these fictional narratives, photos in this case, allow the author to be less exposed, right? Kind of, and removed from their own experiences, right? So so there's something, if we think in terms of kind of cultural tools, like fictional, someone else's stories being a cultural tool, it really provides this bigger, longer mediation between what we're experiencing, right? So it allows us to share much more. I will share one more piece with you. So the final set of data we collected were individual exit interviews with each participant, right, at the end of this project. And one of the purposes of, I mean, there were much more meaningful in a way purposes of this interview, but one of the purposes was also to select between 6 and 12 photos for the final exhibit we had on campus, right? So of all the photos that took over the course of an entire year, now they had to make a selection and also do photo sequencing. We also worked on that, how by specific sequencing of the photographs, you also change the story that you're telling, right? And what happened during the first interview, right? One participant started saying he was curating, right, his exhibit, and then he said something that referred to how the quote-to-quote Grand Central people, what they would expect to see. And then when I probed, that was his phrase for kind of wealthy, privileged people, right? And it also kind of tells you how little Grand Central is just a train station, nothing prestigious about, you know, like a train station. But that was his notion of like somewhere in Manhattan, right? There are these, right, kind of more privileged people. And this is the exhibit, the story that they expect me to tell, right? So, and then in all subsequent interviews, what I started doing is playing with the audience, right? So what is a story that you expect someone who doesn't know, right, who's not from here, right? What is the story that you expect them to see, right, told by you? And then they created a story that they authentically wanted to tell, right, kind of about themselves. So as I put a quote here of a girl named Yenny, and just so you know, like our participants were so proud of the project that they didn't want their pseudonym. There were no pseudonyms. They were always okay with their photographs and real names being used because they were just proud of what we've done and of how we interpreted what we learned through the project. So that was beautiful. It says this sequence is like what I guess people are expecting to see. It's not like really a very personal sequence. I just imagine someone, people who have never been to the Bronx, the general stereotypes, impressions of the Bronx, the mess, the graffiti, the flipped over tires, the bodega, you know, pile of kids in the street, train station, brokenness from the mess, caution signs, that kind of stuff, right? So what we did by shifting audiences, right, we kind of shook these narratives that they were creating in response to stereotypes out there, right? And what we got instead were kind of more proactive. If we think of these as reactive reactive narratives, meaning the kind of narratives we got them to create at the end were more independent, more creative, right? Because they were not primarily in response to what someone else, full of stereotypes and prejudice, expect to see from someone like you, from a community like yours, right? So what it did for this project, it just kind of allowed an access to something that we would have missed, right? Kind of if we didn't play, kind of shifted the audience for which they narrated. Coming to an end, I can skip the next one. I mean, I could maybe just kind of do this kind of short quote. I wanted them to get the message that not all communities are beautiful, that here are beautiful and the ugly side as well. But I wanted to end, even though it's a bittersweet story, I wanted to end with joyfulness, what the communities represent within me and how they shaped me, right? So what we learned from this project and other projects now focusing on the autobiographical, right, versus fictional genres, right, is we can look at these genres, types of writing, media, right, kind of medium of communication we use. We can look at them as cultural tools, right, that provide mediation, kind of, which is about freeing from the immediacy of one's own experiences, right? And then we can think about autobiographical and fictional genres as providing different degrees of mediation, right? Kind of higher degree means greater distance. That means that you feel more liberated to share more. You feel less scrutinized, maybe less vulnerable. So autobiographical story used as an opportunity to recount happenings and focus on landscape of action, right? Kind of as to, again, bring back Bruner's term. So autobiographical stories seem to be used that way, right? Kind of providing landscape of action, what happened, describing the context, right? While fictional genres are more conducive, right, to this kind of landscape of consciousness. They allow fictional narratives, they allow the author to be less exposed and removed from their own experiences, right? So they seem to be more conducive to consideration of various interpersonal and interpersonal dynamics, right? So, and in my students, right, kind of sometimes for some assignments, I tend to do this little trick, right, where I make it hypothetical, but I'm actually learning a lot about them, right? Again, there's something liberating when someone doesn't invite you to kind of talk about yourself directly. Yeah, coming close to an end to a very practical part that will be very short and we'll have time for questions. So I see this kind of multi-voicedness, right, as these kind of multi-layered photographs. This photograph, right, seems like there's a movement. It's so dynamic just because there are multiple layers, right, on multiple photographs, one over the other. I like thinking of these multiple narrating practices in a similar way, right? They kind of portray a much richer, much dynamic picture, right, about youth's sense making. So to try kind of doing some summary of these points, right? So this multi-voicedness captures the complexity of human sense making, right? By inviting multiple perspectives, genres, and expressive forms. It allows us to see how different contexts, audiences, and purposes shape the meaning people make. And we know for sure they do, right? They really do. And this approach moves beyond merely reproducing events, right? What happened and this and then, right? Focusing instead on the dynamic, relational, and context-dependent nature of narration. Multivoicedness reveals the tensions, contradictions, and shifts in perspective that are often silenced in single-voiced accounts. And it captures the contextual nature of psychological process, right? So now I'm saying this as a psychologist, developmental psychologist, right? Where we often think of context as just the backdrop, right? So that's kind of the background of our development and not a constitutive part, right? Not a constitutive element of human development. And emphasizes that sense making is not fixed, but emergent and relational. So now to take all these theory, I really see theory and method as one and the same, right? So how this looks in practice. I'll give you some example from my teaching, right? So I always, as I said, a few years ago, I abandoned the genre of college essay, right? I just don't do that. And I don't do typical research papers. No one does that in real life except from academics. So we write research papers, but college essay is just genre that is not as meaningful for students as many other genres that some of which I will share with you now that I have them write, create in my classes. So what I'm doing, I'm using this principle for my research where I play with audience, purpose, genre to create college assignments, right? Some example, I'm sharing this from you, right? I have my students write op-ed pieces, right? They need to find, first they need to flip the newspapers and then find something that triggers them, excites them, and they need to write an op-ed. Everything needs to be as if they were going to submit it, and sometimes they do submit it, right, to a newspaper. In my developmental class, students develop products, services, targeting, right, children and youth of specific age, specific issue, right? It needs to be science, developmental psychology informed, but they pitch it. It's like a Shark Tank, right, kind of pitch that they're doing on that show. When I teach adolescent development, I love doing these letters, right? As you can tell, I have students write a letter to their teenage self, right? So there's more to that prompt, and then I have them write a letter to their future self. In my senior seminar class in developmental psychology, one of the major assignments is writing an actual white paper, right, policy paper on an issue relevant, right, in their local community pertaining to child and adolescent development. Here I shared, so here you see this newspaper, mock newspaper. in my intro to psychology, right, trying to teach them history of psychology and how the evolution of psychology is directly related to what happens in the world and how the world is changing, like political, social events in the world, right? I have them create newspapers dated December 31st, right, that given year, and assign different groups in class different years throughout the 20th and early 21st century. So we kind of have a kind of century, right, in review. But they create these newspapers, right? And now with technology and templates, they can all do it, right? It doesn't require like sophisticated artistic skills. It's awesome for them to do. It's great for me to grade, right? Just some examples, right? As I said, I don't do, maybe some reaction papers I do, but aside from that, I don't do regular college essays. It's always something of, here what you have is a pamphlet to show that they learn about child development and creating pamphlets for physician's office, right, for parents to be, that are about kind of child development during the first year, or right, it can be during like early childhood, that can change. And now thinking how this can be used in youth work, I'll give, just to tease you, like some some takeaways. So first, I just need to say, someone coming from formal higher education context, I just need to reflect briefly on what I see as never more important feature of youth work, right, as a form of non-formal education. So when you think about formal education, is at its heart a visionary endeavor, right, kind of prepares young people for citizenship, careers, right, and participation in society. But the system often moves too slowly, right? It takes years to update curricula or methods, right? And but by the time the changes are made, the world has already shifted, right? So in that sense, I see non-formal education and youth work in that sense as kind of much more agile, right? Kind of much more conducive to kind of fast adaptation, right, to the way in which the world is changing. So yeah, kudos to you all for the work you're doing, right? And it's more important than ever. I really see it. So my first point, right, kind of is that instead of only kind of doing traditional needs assessment, which are based on what young people lack or struggle with right now, we should also ask, what will young people need to thrive in the future, right? So youth work can be visionary, right? It can create programs not just as a reaction to problems, but as a preparation for the world that is coming, right? So in other words, a phrase used in youth work, right, kind of that I know it, I don't impose as someone, right, who's an expert in that anymore, right, kind of future fit youth work, right, kind of means kind of helping young people develop the skills, imagination, and resilience they need, right, they will need to navigate challenges, right, we may not yet fully see, right, but which are already emerging. So collecting and weaving together young people's stories and perspectives, right, from different backgrounds, communities, and vintage points, right, can be very, very enriching. So to kind of, yeah, summarize it, right, so give voice. So using this work, right, this methodology, I think, can give voice to multiple perspectives. Instead of assuming what young people need, we hear directly from them in their own words about their dreams and challenges. We can spot emerging needs early, right, by paying attention to what young people imagine for their future. We can anticipate the skills, supports, and opportunities they will need. Then we can design programs with them, not just for them, right, where my part comes in. Multi-voice narratives can guide the co-creation of youth programs, right, that prepared them today, right, for the uncertainties of tomorrow. And it can encourage creativity and ownership, right? Again, you're greater experts in this, I don't need to tell you, right? But when young people hear their voices reflected in programs, they feel seen, right? And they kind of engage more deeply. So this methodology helps us move away from deficit-based approach, just like I do in my research, right? Not focusing on what youth are missing right now, right? Towards kind of possibility-based approach, right? What futures are youth imagining, and how can we prepare them to shape those futures? I mean, I have my students do that when they're writing letters to their future selves, right? I focus more on what they see as aspects of development that continue evolving, right, and how they see individual development, right? But this can be used for something that's beyond individual development. Just kind of some ideas, right? Kind of these are translations of some of the things that I use kind of in my classes, but maybe kind of future postcards, right? asking young people to write or draw a postcard from the year, let's say 2040, addressed to themselves today, right? I like all these things also that kind of can be displayed, just kind of so I like when students take pride of their work and when we disseminate it. Story circles with multiple perspectives, right? News from the future exercise inspired by my year in review assignment that I shared before. Again, we could kind of have youth create mock newspaper headlines or short news reports, right? From 10, 20 years in the future, saying kind of youth-led innovation solves local housing crisis, right? Kind of just kind of seeing what they envision. Like I would love to see that. Program co-design labs, right, where they're kind of included, narrative exhibits and so on. As I said, I'm a fan of exhibit, celebrating students' work, but I took already plenty of time. I'll stop here without elaborating further, but I'm here if you need questions and want me to elaborate further on any of what I've said.